Sacramento actually doing this stuff.
Now, with great controversy, as you know.
My presentation is
But,
the one that I heard.
yeah, with great controversy.
Now it says field notes for sketch on.
What bad news? How did that
It's
go?
happening as we're speaking. Like what I VanDeveer 2 weeks ago, it would be, it would come by events. So where are you?
I'm still Colorado State.
Okay.
Anyway. Well, that's true. You were here all day.
So I'm glad next year we did.
Oh boy. If you want to work on energy,
Exactly. It's correct, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we want to get started. I want to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name's Jeff DeBelko. I direct the Environmental Change and Security Program here, and I'm thrilled to be one of the two programs here at the center directing it. We'll turn the floor over to David Biet, the director of the Kennedy Institute, in just one moment to chair our first panel. I want to welcome you all for a discussion of climate change politics in North America. This is an issue of obvious import. Don't have to explain that to this audience, but one that doesn't necessarily come under discussion with this regional approach. One that I think has grown out of even a smaller regional approach, looking at New England and Eastern Canadian initiatives, cross-border initiatives that some of our intellectual drivers for today's discussion, Stacy, VanDeveer, and Henrik, Selin, have been working on, and many of you as well. So we're thrilled that such a distinguished group of scholars and practitioners have come together to share their insights, in fact also going the extra mile and writing papers that you can find in draft form on our website. So we're thrilled that they're here to share their insights with all of us. A word about the Wilson Center and the Environmental Change and Security Program, and then I'll turn the floor over right to David. The Wilson Center is actually the former memorial to Woodrow Wilson, so instead of building a monument a couple blocks away in the mall, they set up a living memorial because he was our only president who had both, who had a PhD and so had a real academic background, and then before he became a politician. So it's a place that the worlds of scholarship and policy come together to try to learn from one another. The Environmental Change and Security Program is a program that's now 12 years old that tries to look at issues of environment, health, demography, and view them in a broader foreign policy, development policy, and even security policy context. And so today's discussion fits right into that effort. We do that with publications, some of which I hope you will pick up outside, as well as meetings like this. It is important for us always to thank those who have made these kinds of efforts possible. Certainly here at the Wilson Center in particular, David's program has been very supportive on the outside the Canadian Embassy and the Energy Foundation, and we'd like to thank all of them. I would ask you when we get to the discussion period that you use one of these microphones, and we'll bring them to you if you have a question, because we are webcasting this meeting live. And it'll be archived video, so we want the folks on the web to be able to hear your question. So I'd like to introduce David Biet, head of our Kennedy Institute, for a couple comments and introduce the panel. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here today. Again, as Jeff said, my name's David Biet, and I'm director of the Canada Institute, which has been around here for almost 5 years. We haven't done a lot on environment, and it's about time we did. We've done a lot on energy, which has been interesting. We have a semi-annual series on an energy forum. We've looked at cross-border cooperation, the infrastructure in North America, security of natural gas supply, oil sands, electricity, and our next program coming up in the fall is going to be on the security of critical infrastructure. We've done a lot of other things. We have publications outside. We do a publication, One Issue, Two Voices, about twice a year, when we take one issue and look at it from both sides of the border, not necessarily from opposite points of view, but sort of from a Canadian perspective and an American perspective. It's our pleasure to be here today. We've got a program coming up next week, just a quick ad on the emergence of cross-border regions between Canada and the United States that we're doing at CSIS over on 18th and K. So see me if you're interested in that, or look at our website. And I will repeat again to the audience tuning in from outside and you folks that the papers are posted on our website. and we will have the PowerPoints and the video from this program posted there afterwards as well. So with that, we have a very tight timetable today, and I have told the speakers that I have little cards to tell them when their time is up. But we will begin with an overview from Henrik, Selin, and Stacy VanDeveer. Henrik from Boston University and Stacy from the University of New Hampshire. And we'll move into comments by Peter Stoett from Concordia University in Montreal, and then Tim Kennedy from Global Public Affairs in Ottawa will give some discussion comments. So, Stacy, over to you, and Henrik.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. It's great to be here. We've worked to get this conference up and running for some months now, so it's great that it's finally here. I want to thank Jeff and David and the staff here who have been fantastic. We don't normally at regular old public universities get such facilities and such help with such things, so it's just been glorious from my perspective. Do indeed check out the papers online. You'll hear that more than once. As academics, we get very proud of ourselves when we all manage to produce the paper on time and get it online. So they're there, so please check them out. So it falls to me just to give a few introductory comments, really just to get us started for this afternoon and for the second half tomorrow. So we talked about, Henrik and I, the sort of introduction as this notion of the state of play, that what we really wanted to do with the workshop was bring together both folks from the academic and analytical communities and some practitioners to talk about what is going on at various levels of governance around climate change in various parts of the continent, and to ask questions about what their connections are and how they fit together and what is driving them, and these sorts of inquiry. Now, if I manage to do this gloriously. And so, as you know, I will not spend much time on the international on the international frameworks, but of course there is a UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. There was and is, of course, a Kyoto Protocol from 1997. And what we were interested in when we started, Henrik and I have done some research and writing about the climate change-related cooperation among New England states, with New England states and the provinces in the eastern half of Canada. And we got interested in sort of the climate change politics and dynamics at multiple levels of government. And other people on the program over over this afternoon and tomorrow have also been interested in looking at climate politics in the private sector and in the public sector. And what really got us thinking about it in these terms for this conference was that there is, of course, a great deal of ink spilled and hot air produced debating Kyoto and the fact that there are 3 countries in North America and they have at least three different positions on Canada on Kyoto. We used to say they had 3 different positions on Kyoto. Now I think it's fairly clear that there are 4 or 6 or 9 among the 3 countries' positions on Kyoto. But more to the point, the sort of Kyoto Protocol dominance of our debating climate politics was something we were trying to get around, in part because there is so much going on in so many different directions in the private sector, among NGOs, in the public sector at different levels. And so that's what sort of inspired us to, as we note here, get beyond Kyoto. See there? Now, so just a few introductory comments of things we're going to be talking about in the next day and a half. As you know, there are climate politics developing in these various sectors and across different levels of governance. And in particular, the dynamics of kind of leader-laggard dynamics among the private sector firms, among states, that there are some states, some municipalities, some medium-sized ones, some large ones, moving out fairly aggressively, engaging in climate policy protection, and others lagging behind, and that the opposition to climate change policy and the advocates of climate change policy are noticeably active at all levels of government and in the public and private spheres. And so again, we kept returning to this variety and this complexity. And the other thing that quite interested us was to pull together folks who are interested in the continental economy and what does this mean? What does it mean that California is going in one direction on climate policy and Washington is going in a different one? And at the time, we thought we knew where Canada was going on climate policy, and now there's sort of changes there with the government change. So just to sort of pull folks together and ask some of these questions and look at the connections. So just briefly, as you can see from your outline for today and tomorrow, folks looking at our next presentation talking about the state of play in Canada as we speak about climate change politics and particularly around Kyoto. A number of us, Henrik and I, Alex Farrell, Barry Rabe, looking at politics in the states at the state level, and to some extent some of the Canadian provinces here and there. Virginia Haufler and Dr. Levy on the private sector, and the list goes on, as you see, connecting the names on your itinerary with the slide. I hope you all stick around for a while and come back tomorrow. Thank you so much for coming. And we'll let Peter talk to us a little bit and get us started on what's going on north of the border.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'd like to thank the organizers for having me here and apologize in advance if I nod off. I'm rather tired. I flew in early this morning in a Kyoto-exempt airplane. Yes, beyond Kyoto. Well, I think this is a very appropriate topic. One of the problems that I think has permeated the Canadian debate is that we haven't, to some extent at least, we haven't considered going beyond Kyoto. And it's become a real lightning rod for partisan politics. Basically, those that support Canada's commitment to Kyoto have aligned themselves very firmly against those who have made what I consider a fairly reasonable realization, which is that we're not going to make those commitments, and in fact we risk making ourselves look rather silly if we keep insisting that we will. Nonetheless, Kyoto, you know, that's what you'll hear about when it comes to climate change, and that's why I especially welcome venues such as this one, where we can talk about alternatives. I'd rather have seen the Canadian government make its commitments, meet its commitments. I'd rather see Kyoto work. However, we have to deal with the realities that are before us. It is premature to declare the Canadian implementation of Kyoto dead, but it's certainly apparent that the new Harper government, the minority conservative government, is making what I might call rather audible funeral arrangements. It's moved with rather remarkable speed toward dismantling whatever scaffolding the previous Liberal government had managed in its own procrastinate manner to erect. And public comments by our Environment Minister, Rona Ambrose, and our Natural Resource Minister, Gary Lune, have made it clear that less Kyoto, more Ottawa, and the critics would argue more Washington, is the preferred approach. And the mantra that we're hearing emanating right now, keep in mind that as we speak, the Canadian government and our Environment Minister is actually chairing a session of the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change in Bonn, Germany. But the mantra that we're hearing right now is that we need a, quote, made in Canada approach. In terms of environmental policy, it's difficult at this stage to get a clear view of what exactly is going to be occurring there. And I think Tim will have as clear view as anyone from Ottawa, and I look forward to his comments. However, clearly there will be an effort to revamp our Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which is sort of the keystone legislation with which we approach environmental policy in Canada. That's a bit controversial because some of the greenhouse gases, in fact, are now listed under that act. And therefore subject to regulation. There will be a focus on air pollution. This will be the major thing that has been promised that will come once the Conservatives actually do put together some sort of concerted policy. And also renewed focus on Great Lakes pollution. This is what I've gathered from discussing this with people that are supposed to know what they're doing in Ottawa. That being said, things are still relatively up in the air. But one thing is for sure, this is a new government. It has a different mandate than the one that preceded it. Its main mandate is to get reelected in a majority position. However, when it comes to Kyoto, it's been very forthright, and it's with its statements that we will, A, not meet the commitments which were made in 1997, which was that Canada would actually reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 6% of its 1990 levels. Currently, we are somewhere, I believe, 30% over our 1990 levels. So you can imagine the type of economic sacrifice it would entail to do this by 2008 or even by 2012, the longer term. They've also made it quite, I think anyways, ideologically, it's very unlikely that a government that's elected on a conservative banner will go ahead and enforce strong regulatory measures on what we refer to as the large final emitters, the large industries, oil and gas manufacturing, which in fact produce something like 50% of our emissions. So ideologically and in terms of realistic policy goals, I think we have to start either renegotiating the Kyoto commitments, and I'm not sure how that will work out, and the international community has already lamented such an effort, I think. Certainly the opposition parties in Ottawa have done so. And the more drastic step, of course, would be to pull out of Kyoto altogether. I've been, informed, assured, I'm not sure which, that that is not on the conservative agenda, that we want to stay in Kyoto. However, we would like basically take back our promise of 1997. How does that look diplomatically? Yes, of course, it doesn't look too promising. I'll just make a few comments. I realize we're all short on time. I would argue that there are some ideas that we sort of need to get out on the table, I think, in Canada. And all of this discussion is helpful, I think, for the United States as well. Things that have colored, if you wish, the debate over Kyoto. And again, the debate on climate change has centered almost exclusively on Kyoto, to the point of distraction, perhaps. But I'll just make a few statements that I put in my paper in terms of the current policy context. I think it is, and thus my enthusiasm for conferences like this, which is, as Stacy said, go beyond this sort of international framework by itself. It is erroneous to assume that national leadership will someday emerge on this issue. And there seemed to be a feeling in Canada that, well, one day, the federal leaders will understand that climate change is, in fact, perhaps the most important issue we face long term, and not just in terms of policy adjustments that need making, but also adaptation, and also galvanizing the international community towards action. Well, we've waited pretty long, and we really haven't seen it. And I would argue that we won't. There are a number of reasons for this. It's extremely difficult in Canada, for example, to implement climate change policy. National leaders can go to international conferences and make promises, but when they come home, they have to some extent, and this can be overstated, by the way, to sort of apologize for lack of action, but by and large, it's quite accurate to say that they have to negotiate the implementation of international treaties like this with various bodies, various levels of governance, most notably, of course, at the provincial level. And this is what happens in a federal state. Also, even at the municipal level, which is difficult for a federal government to do, because in order to do that, they have to step over the provincial level. And I'm not going to say that Canadians are a territorial bunch, but nonetheless, there are within each level of governance certain assumptions that are made about territory and who has the say to do what and when. That's one reason federal leadership's lacking. Another, you might argue, is that there's been a sort of disingenuous commitment, if you wish, to this in the first place. The previous Liberal governments, right, we had two that preceded the current Conservative government, did make these commitments. However, many critics have argued they did not, until it was too little too late, actually embark on a serious program that might result in some serious changes. Most of those programs have subsequently been dismantled by the Harper government. One in particular I find unfortunate, which is Energide, which I know we have energy experts here that will discuss this, but I think that was a short-sighted. But on the other hand, there were some programs that probably amounted to spending a lot of money on, no pun intended, hot air. So there might be some wisdom in some of the cuts. However, nonetheless, we have not has seen a history of political leadership, I think, at the federal level. The American case I won't even have to comment on regarding, I think, climate change. And we'll come back to this, no doubt. So I think it's a mistake to keep waiting, that one day we'll see enough icebergs melt, we'll see enough hurricanes and so on for federal leadership to become inevitable. It is time to really turn our focus, I believe, onto subnational units. And here we have a plethora of activity that's occurring. As Stacy and Henrik will describe, of course, there is a very, well, relatively successful, and perhaps it will be very successful, New England governors and Eastern Canadian premiers climate change action plan. Right? There is also within the United States the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement, which involves 231 mayors. I might be out of date here, but the last time I checked their website, 231 mayors representing over 45 million Americans. There is also within Canada, 20 Canadian counties, towns, and cities belong to the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives and have signed a pledge to work towards emission reduction. This includes, incidentally, Calgary and Edmonton, our two main oil-based cities. So there's a lot happening there on a sort of transgovernmental level. There's a lot happening, I would argue, on a municipal level, which is an interesting area of politics to study as well. Waiting for national leadership, I think, is an error at this point in time. Another point I make is that I think we need to, and I come from more or less an environmentalist background, and it has been very difficult to openly discuss this question of adaptation to climate change. The emphasis has always been on you're either going to mitigate climate change, or we're actually going to try and reverse it somehow. I'm unclear scientifically how it can be reversed. But nonetheless, certainly, emissions reductions are a big central part to this. However, the sort of taboo on discussing adaptation, I think, has been a mistake. It is happening. I mean, if you need evidence of climate change, then I think the most obvious place to look is the Canadian Arctic. And here we're seeing noticeable changes in the local environment, which is affecting people. We do have people that live up there, incidentally, not just polar bears, although only polar bears get on the cover of Time Life magazine. But, they will have to adapt to what's happening here. Is Ottawa going to help them, or are we simply not going to talk about this reality? And here again, I sort of, to some extent, applaud the Conservative government because at least they've made some overtures in the direction of discussing adaptation. Now, adaptation sounds as sort of defeatist ring for many environmentalists. If we're admitting, okay, we're beat, Kyoto's not going to work, we have to just adjust, and we'll move on. And so you understand that there is a sort of normative prohibition almost to discussing this. However, I think I'm sensitive to that argument, but I think it's too late for that. And openly discussing adaptation, most noticeably in Canada's case, responses for regarding the North, will frame the issue as a mainstream concern. It'll provoke more reasonable demands on this government and whatever government follows to begin thinking aloud on this issue. And admitting adaptation is both inevitable and necessary confirms the science behind climate change as well. I would also add that I mentioned federal-provincial relations, and here's a real example of where the previous government, I should say, pardon me, in 1997 was the Chrétien government before Paul Martin's government. Many people would argue, really mucked things up. They had an opportunity to get together with the provinces and arrive at some sort of consensual approach. They acted a bit too late, some have argued. Some argued they didn't act in good enough faith, what have you. It didn't work. Our provinces are radically different in terms of their resource base, in terms of their energy production, in terms of the amount of automobiles they have, and so forth. And we have everything from prairies to mega cities. So this was an opportunity, perhaps, that passed us by, unfortunately. And many people in the provinces looked at the Canadian government's willingness at Kyoto to largely follow what was then the American lead, and agreed to a 6% reduction as a bit of a betrayal. And you could almost see them, thinking, well, wait till those guys get back to Canada and they have to deal with us on this. I think in the future it's obvious, it's self-evident, and I hope that the Conservative government will have the instinct to do so. It's necessary that we have to establish a very firm provincial-federal dialogue on this issue. Now, we have to some extent. There's a Council of Ministers, for example. And, we really have to focus on that project and go beyond that, actually. I had a few points I was going to mention about credit emissions trading. I think that'll come back up. One thing I'll say for certain, the present government in Canada is not prepared to engage in international credit emissions trading. There might be a Canadian system set up. We might also discuss, and I'm glad we'll have a paper on this later, something within the North American context, perhaps something driven through the CEC of the NAFTA regarding emissions trading. That might be an interesting made in North America approach that we could pursue. But they've made it quite clear that they will not purchase, and again, they use the term hot air credits from countries like Russia, which essentially are in a fortuitous situation because they've deindustrialized to the point where they no longer produce the emissions they once did. This will not be a difficult policy to sell in Canada. It was a weakness, I believe, in Kyoto in the first place. It was largely done as a compromise measure in order to get the United States to initially agree with the Kyoto Protocol. I would also make the argument, and again, I know this will come up with Dr. Rollins is here. He'll talk about energy. But I believe, anyways, we can do a lot more to sell. Canada can, in particular, renewable energies abroad. And we're still dealing, I think, with a foreign aid program that is more or less centered around establishing petroleum-based economies. This is something that has been changing in recent years. I'm glad to see it will. However, I'm a bit concerned that the new government, which is, after all, based essentially in Alberta, where we're opening up tar sands and so forth, might not see the long-term value of that proposal. I would also argue we have a unique opportunity, I think, to stress the impact of global warming, and this relates to the ecosystemic impact that it's having. We know that climate change will result in shifts in invasive species behavior, for example. And the most popular one right now, of course, relates to in Canada, relates to the mountain pine beetle, which has been ravaging national parks in British Columbia and even threatening forests in Washington state. Officials in Alberta are setting fires and traps. They're felling thousands of trees in an effort to keep the beetle at bay, as we call it. This is a tiny little thing, but it destroys the forest. It can destroy the forestry industry. Many would argue that the reason it's happening is related to milder temperatures, and I believe it is more precipitation in these regions. One former government official who was involved in the recently negotiated softwood lumber dispute, which you might be familiar with. It's been dominating Canadian-American relations for a couple of years now. One senior official involved in those negotiations told me the reason why we had an agreement this year, one of the reasons, an agreement which clearly went against what the Canadian government initially wanted. We gave in a bit, there's no doubt about it, gave in a couple $2 billion, etc. But one of the main reasons was that this pine beetle is in fact ravaging the forest, and if we don't cut this stuff down now and export it to the United States, we're going to have larger problems in the future. Now, it's difficult in the public eye to make a direct link between Canada's reduced bargaining position and global warming. However, these are the sort of things that I think will permeate ultimately in the discussion, and should be, and environmentalists and the new government alike should take advantage of that. So it's senseless, I think, to prolong the debate over the most appropriate level of environmental governance. In Canada, it's quite clear that all levels are heavily involved. We will need Aboriginal involvement, we will need municipal, we will need provincial, etc. We will need the whole beautiful array of civil society. The big question might be, in fact, with the new government, and whether or not they end up with majority government in the next couple of years. The big question might be whether they have the legitimacy, or again, the instinctive openness, beyond repeated bromides to the value of decentralization that they've often made, to pursue such a broad agenda when it is related to a topic they do not find particularly galvanizing in the first place. But I applaud the ability, or I should say the foresight of the conveners of this conference. I think it is time to look beyond Kyoto, keeping international forums in mind, of course, as very strong pillars in any sort of climate change approach. We would be, I think, we would be falling short if we simply look to national and global leadership. The sign says done. I am done.
Thank you, Peter. Tim Kennedy has experience in the political world in Canada and in public affairs, and he writes a regular sort of environmental review of what's going on, and I've read it, and it's pretty darn neutral. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Peter, and he's going to comment on what's going on in Canada.
Peter already went.
Tim, sorry.
Thanks very much. I'll just share briefly a little bit about my background, and then I'll go on to hopefully give you some insights into the current Conservative administration in Canada. I have experience working with national environmental organizations in Canada. I worked for some of those during the Kyoto period, 1997. And then I spent about 3 years as the environmental advisor to the Conservative Party. At that time, it was the Canadian Alliance Party, which merged with the older Progressive Conservative Party to become the current Conservative Party. How's that? So I have been involved in government relations for the last 4 years, and I work with largely with natural resource-based companies, upstream oil and gas, mining, and forestry. So I have been working on climate change policy, observing very carefully what's going on in Ottawa for those 4 years. So it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. Let me just start with what I think is a critical issue, which is the political interests of the Conservative Party, and really the base politics of what things look like in Canada right now. I think, as everyone knows, the Conservatives came to power with a minority government. In terms of numbers, a relatively weak minority government, but in terms of where the opposition parties are, actually quite a strong minority government. So, for instance, the Liberal Party, who were in power for many years, going through leadership that's going to take them right up to Christmas time at the end of this year. And then you can imagine it'll take several months after that for the Liberal Party to really get going again. So the Conservatives really are looking at their entire focus right now, and in fact, Prime Minister Harper has been talking very much openly in the last couple of weeks about the majority that he needs to do what he needs to do. So that clearly is the focus. I think that Canada could see an election. I know this is crystal balling, but probably at the earliest at the end of this year, at the latest probably spring of next year, and that's important for all these sorts of issues. The particular voter that the Conservatives are going after is important in the context of understanding Kyoto and climate change. And that is, the strategy is quite similar to the Republican strategy in the U.S. in that they're really going after the broad middle class. And this is largely made up of suburban, ex-urban, and rural voters. And then their other key constituency is Quebec. Now this actually creates quite an interesting dynamic, because suburban, especially rural voters, tend not to really care too much about Kyoto. Quebec, I think when the polling has been done in Quebec, it's close to 90%, I think, of Quebecers who know the theme of Kyoto, at least know the title Kyoto, and say they support it. So of course that's very it's very fragile. What that means, it's not very deep at all. But in terms of a political interest, Quebec is key for the Conservatives to move forward to a majority. So the Conservatives understand that they really do have to do some significant things on climate change policy, even while making, as Peter very ably stated, some very clear communications about that Kyoto, the targets for Canada, are completely not realizable. So they are going to do some things. Again, remember, for the Conservatives, they're not interested in the very strong environmentalist voice that's largely based in urban centers. That's not their constituency. That's not what's going to give them the majority. Quebec, where they came second, to the surprise of many people in this last election, second in over 40 ridings. That's really their key constituency. So I think that's kind of the political context I wanted to give you. The other thing, and Peter mentioned in his paper a few things that I'd just like to comment on. One is that a Conservative government, you tend to think, very friendly to big business. In fact, what we have found on the ground in Ottawa, and what we've found just in terms of their general interest, is that Prime Minister Harper is actually extremely focused, again, on that middle-class voter, and that also means actually access to his government. And this is very interesting. Whereas we could be trying to set up a meeting for a president of some company, some big company, with previous governments, they would get that meeting with the minister. It's almost impossible to get that meeting with the current Conservative government. There's a real sensitivity around access and accountability, which is new to this government, but at the same time, it also speaks to a consistency with Prime Minister Harper's interest in small and medium-sized enterprises, and not necessarily being dictated to by big business. So one area that I'd like to disagree with Peter, just comment again on, is that the Conservatives, with the necessity of actually showing the public that they're somewhat serious about climate change, I think there is going to be some significant regulation. The second thing I'll say is taxation on the large final emitter group, which is the large industry in Canada. This connects with a couple of political points. One, again, is that they need to demonstrate some action. The second is that there is absolutely no political downside for the Conservatives in not undertaking some significant regulation of the large final emitters. I'll take you back just a second to the previous government, the Liberal government. They had implemented a system, or were starting to implement a system, where these big companies had to reduce their emissions by 15% emissions intensity, and there was a cap on the price of the emissions that they had to pay for at $15 a ton. Really, from the government's perspective and from the Conservative perspective, and I was involved at that time, there was really very little resistance from industry in Canada. There were some key large final emitters who had some concerns, but generally speaking, the upstream oil and gas companies, there was not a lot of resistance to this approach. This was actually negotiated largely with the upstream oil and gas sector. So for the Conservatives, who have a very strong Alberta base, that's where the oil and gas industry is in Canada, and also a sensitivity to not being so closely aligned with the oil and gas sector, for the Conservatives, and with Quebec interests on their plate, actually doing something in terms of moving on regulating industry appeals to that, and it also connects with this long-standing, and I'm sure you know this very well at the Woodrow Wilson Centre, this long-standing Canadian interest in at least doing something that's stronger than the states, than south of the border. So that connects as well from the federal level. If the Conservatives undertake a certain degree of regulation, or for instance a taxation, an example could be a $15 per ton tax on all the large final emitters, that is certainly going beyond the U.S. and can deflate some of the criticism about Canada, taking all of its policy from Washington. So that's a sort of key political thing. So in terms of the specific steps for moving forward, the Conservatives have stated, and also they are particularly interested in technology. There are some key issues related to the oil sands, which is a very significant source in the last few years, in particular in carbon dioxide and other emissions. I think the Conservatives have a very strong interest in looking at enhanced oil recovery, or from the environmental side, carbon sequestration projects. Even though they're incredibly expensive, you can trap huge amounts of greenhouse gases. So that's one interest. Another interest, I think, is the Conservatives will start looking federally again at some nuclear projects, which for the Liberal government previous to them had not been on the books for a long time. The Liberals refused to look at that. So the Conservatives will be looking at that as well. The other thing is that the Conservatives, while the current Conservative interest is not in interfering too much with the market, this past budget was very interesting in that they have followed, in some ways, the Republican model of lots of different tax incentives for various things. So they've complicated things, but they're using the tax system to incent change. And I think we will see in the next couple of years some new tax incentives for technology development. And also, I mentioned a tax, potentially a tax on carbon from the large final emitters. I think that's a very strong possibility, which is counterintuitive for Canadians to think that the Conservatives would do that. Industry's happy right now. Upstream oil and gas is happy. I think it's a real possibility. Internationally, just one last comment, and that is very strong interest, obviously, in working. Security is a big theme, and accountability, and working with Canada's, in a sense, natural partners. And that is, again, getting back to the table, working with the United States, and also back to the table, working strongly with Australia. We can see this past week John Howard both in Canada, in Ottawa, and also in Washington. So those are some of the next steps, I think, for the Conservative government. But as Peter said, just to reiterate, Kyoto really is, in name, still going to be in place. There's no political upside to getting out of it. But I think in game, we're going to see the Conservatives not, and they have been very clear that they're not going to reach the targets, and it's time to move away. Just one last point. The trouble that Canada really got into, and again, Peter commented on this in his paper, the original target that Canada set out, I'm not sure if people are familiar with this, but it's a very basic reason why Canada ended up with a 6% below 1990 target. Some of you might know this, but in fact, it was a last-second decision by the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister Chrétien at the time, to do better than the U.S. And I found that very striking because there really was no complexity. Canada went in with looking at a target somewhere between 0 and -3, which had been discussed with the provinces and came out with -6. And it was just because at the last second, the United States came in with a -5. So not a lot of, I mean, that's politics for you. But that was the problem, huge internal problems for Canada as a federation, and so that's what we're stuck with. And currently, with 30% over, and this is 2004 numbers, of course, 30% over our current Kyoto targets. So I think that's my presentation.
Okay, well, thank you, Tim. And who would have thought back in 1997 the oil prices would be where they are today, and that the oil sands would be actually pumping out as much as they are. So let's open up to discussion, questions, comments for any of the folks up here. When you do, there are microphones in the back, and there's one up here. Please identify yourselves. Here and then in the back.
Hi, my name is Alex Farrell from UC Berkeley. I have a highly practical question. Let's assume that there is a tax placed on carbon. How would exports be treated? Would the exported oil and exported gas be taxed as well as that used domestically?
I mean, this is, of course, the idea of a tax. Nobody has given me a really clear indication, for instance, in any minister's office or prime minister's offices, that this is going to happen, but certainly I think there's some discussion about it. My understanding is that it would be again, the previous government had put on a cap of $15 a ton based on the target that they were working out for the large final emitters. My sense is that something like a $15 per ton or $10 per ton on emissions in general is what they're looking at in terms of exports. So I can't read the implications for that. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Back.
Susie Moser from the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder. I'm not sure who wants to answer the question, but you just mentioned Australia. Since it now is part of NAFTA, I'm interested to hear your comments on how does that change the political dynamics among the, three laggard countries, or two at least, in terms of, the climate action. What do you see, how that impacts what happens in each one of the countries?
I'm sorry, did you say Australia is part of NAFTA?
Yes. They just signed on. They just signed on recently, believe it or not.
To NAFTA?
Yes. It's a neighbor, right? They signed to NAFTA.
I'm sorry. Perhaps we're thinking of something else.
No. I just come back from Australia, and that's what,
Yeah.
what I've been...
The North American Free Trade Agreement.
Yes. Sorry, maybe this is big news.
It's news. It's news to me as well.
I just heard it from Australia in Australia when I was there a week ago.
I guess they haven't publicized this here yet. Yeah, it was a very backroom deal, I guess. Australia has had an off-and-on relationship with international climate change negotiations as well, of course. I mean, here was an example. Many people would argue at the original Kyoto negotiations, Australia got it right. They went in there with a firm, national policy, and they managed to, in fact, end up with increases instead of decreases under the Kyoto regime. Now, subsequent to that, for various reasons, they've refused to play along. But I think that there is a possibility, and I mentioned this in my paper as well, for Asia Pacific. It's very, very significant that we participate. I'm talking about both Canada and the United States with the Asian states, and there is a forum that's been set up. It'll focus largely, my understanding is, on encouraging voluntary reductions, but also on technology transfer. And most significantly, of course, it involves China. I think anything we can do to include the Asian sphere in this, and Australia obviously is a natural, or should be a natural leader in that regard, in that sphere, is very welcome. Because we can't, and one of the biggest problems with Kyoto naturally was, can we seriously, and this was the Bush administration's main concern, as you might recall, why should we sign on to an agreement when China is not involved? Right? I mean, in the long run, China is supposed to get involved, but it's not in the short term. It has, in other words, no demands for reductions or what have you. Now, I'll leave the question of global justice aside for now, because obviously that's an important issue when it comes to who should be cutting back first and so forth. Historically, we can certainly point to the majority of emissions coming from the north and the west. Nonetheless, at this point, it's essential that China is part of the dialogue, and anything that can be done to improve that, I think, is a wonderful thing. That being said, as soon as this is over, I am going to make a phone call and inform Stephen Harper that he has now joined, Australia has now joined NAFTA. We have to know that. Yeah.
Here, and then there, and then there, and then there.
Hi, I'm David Levy, University of Massachusetts. There's been significant discussion in the Northeast, in RGGI and in RPS, the Renewable Portfolio Standards, about how in the US we can meet those standards by importing hydropower, whether or not it will be allowed. And I know there's some Canadian political involvement. And I'm interested in how much interest there is in Canada in expanding hydro exports, in particular, the political constraints, and how much political activity there is in Canada in trying to influence RPS, RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Trading Initiative, to enable those imports to be counted to meet those targets.
Very briefly, I'll say that yes, there is. The Quebec government's very big on this idea. It does raise some issues because arguably we've had electricity near shortages in the past. But they are, of course, increasing hydro capacity considerably with some new projects that they're opening up. And there's also talk about, I believe, about exporting wind power as well. I think that ultimately, if we did move towards a successful North American-based carbon emission trading regime, it would have to include elements like that. I'm quite certain that the Quebec government, for example, would insist on it. So my short answer would be yes, definitely. The future is there. The only concern it raises with some Quebec nationalists is, yes, it will help fill the coffers. In other words, it'll be certainly a source of revenue. But if we take it too far, do we in fact become dependent on exporting what is arguably our chief resource, which is hydropower, to another country, which could cut us off at any time or what have you? And there's also, I guess, some complications regarding the whole NAFTA energy sector in that regard. We have other people here that could better speak to that. But I think the short answer would be yes.
Peter, didn't Premier Charest just come out in the last little while talking about a renewed strategy on hydro? And I think he said, if people remember here, the big project about 15 years ago now was the Great Whale, La Grande Baleine 2, the second project, and didn't go very far because I think the Northern Cree were very successful in their protest. Charest is not. He's also said we're not going to touch the Great Whale second project. One other comment I'd like to make on Quebec obviously has a huge capacity in hydro. Manitoba has a huge amount of hydro potential as well. Now, the key problem with Manitoba, of course, is transmission. And I know that the Manitoba government was very active in promoting the idea to the federal government, the previous federal government, the idea of getting a good chunk of federal funds to support transmission from Manitoba to Ontario in particular. I also know that internally in the federal government, there was a huge amount of resistance to this because it's incredibly expensive. So Manitoba, in a sense, is stuck, and you can imagine how it is on the map, far away from major centers in the U.S. and Canada. So don't know what's going to happen with that, but it really is an expensive idea, and I don't think it's going to go far under the current government at least. Yeah.
Can I just add real quickly? And the Cree have signed on, in fact, to considerable expansion, with a package which there was some internal controversy, but it's more or less gone through. But there's another controversy here as well, which is that hydropower, as you probably know, is often contested in terms of whether or not it is emission-free. It's certainly not emission-free, but the question is when you turn what used to be pristine woodland into swamps, there's all sorts of methane emission and so forth. So. Although generally it's favored as much better than oil or coal, it is still open to some debate, and any sort of emissions trading system would have to take that into account as well. So.
The politics of hydro don't help in Canada either, because under the Kyoto debate, what's happened is provinces, guess who were the two provinces that sort of championed Kyoto ratification? It was Manitoba and Quebec. Yeah. And they continue to champion Kyoto. Manitoba a little less so, they're not as vocal, but that causes problems internally in Canada, and of course they sort of take a holier-than-thou approach, and that can really tick some people off, so that's a problem too.
Ian Rowlands from the University of Waterloo, and a comment, there may be a question at the end, but I'd appreciate any reactions to the comment, and inspired by Peter's comment reporting on the cancellation of the Energuide for Houses program late last week. This was Canada's home energy rating system, which by some accounts had been deemed to be quite successful in empowering, in particular in response to your comment, Tim, a lot of sort of middle-class Canadians to take on board a systems approach to home energy efficiency activities. Any reactions either of you would have to that? But I guess perhaps more significantly, if I heard correctly, it might be the Australian syndrome here, I'm not sure. If I heard correctly, I think in Quebec there has been a provincial body that has taken on board since last Thursday the responsibility for perhaps the retrofit grant that was going to be made to homeowners, and similar things in New Brunswick, and I know that people are lobbying the Ontario Power Authority, for example. Is this symptomatic perhaps of broader movement from federal to provincial levels about energy/climate strategies? Again, apologies, there's not much of a question in there, but any reactions would be appreciated.
I would hope it is, I suppose. Certainly, this was, in my opinion, a premature act that they took. This was a policy, Energuide was just basically getting off to a good start from everything I've heard. And it's unfortunate, as you say. Now in Quebec, they have a similar policy, which I believe they're cutting back on, but they still have a similar policy that preceded this, right? So my understanding is that's still continuing. Right? I wish my wife was here. She's an expert on Quebec energy policies. So anyway.
Yeah, Ian, I think that largely, that the commentary on it has been that it was too quick a decision. But from the Conservative perspective, I could imagine what they would see as a big chunk of cash dedicated. Obviously, it's a very expensive targeted measure, and I think as climate change policy people know, targeted measures can be incredibly expensive for program issues. And I think, I haven't talked to anyone about this, but I was thinking about this very issue just a couple of days ago, and I thought, from a new government's perspective, who wants to look at, who wants to implement their own projects, I think that they will be looking at targeted measures. But I also know the idea of giving $1,000 for a retrofit for a single house, again, is limited in its greenhouse gas impact. That's my understanding. It is very expensive, and you also have a particular group that may not be linked to the Conservatives, who might be the first to the trough. So I think there are politics involved in that, but again, you would have strongly environmentally interested people and strongly educated people, maybe largely in urban centers, who would be knowledgeable about that sort of targeted measure. So I think there is politics playing in that, but there's obviously some good reasons behind it. So I don't know all of them, but those are just some guesses. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a question here in the back, right there.
Hi, Simone Pulver, Brown University. I have two quick questions. One, if one of you could elaborate what it's actually going to look like for Canada to remain party to Kyoto but default on its targets. And then two, is Mexico and collaborations with Mexico part of the political dialogue at all? Where does Mexico fit in on the sort of terrain of Canadian climate politics?
With regard to Mexico, certainly, the CEC, the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, which is the NAFTA environment arm, Canada plays an active role in the CEC. It's located in Montreal. What I will find interesting, perhaps, is if we do have a strong effort to move towards air pollution as one of the main themes in Canada's environmental policy. Then there might be a lot of opportunity there to cooperate through technology transfer, et cetera, with the Mexicans, because it's obviously a tremendous problem in Mexico City and elsewhere. So there could be some Canadian contribution that could be made there. I'm not going to exaggerate the extent to which Mexico is on the Canadian political landscape. We are understandably rather U.S. fixated, just like Mexico would say the same thing about Canada, I think. We're both oil exporting countries, and we have similar concerns regarding the U.S. energy market, et cetera. So we probably have more in common with Mexico than we do in ways that we can concretely assist them, but I think the CEC is a good way to start. And the first question, I'm sorry, was...
Kyoto, getting out of Kyoto.
Yeah. I mean, in this sense, we're heading... the argument is we're going head first into a major embarrassment, and I think that's understandable. It could only weaken the accord itself. As those of you that study international regimes know, I mean, the more non-compliance, visible non-compliance you have, the less robust the regime becomes over time. And there are really no serious compliance mechanisms, let's face it, right? So there won't be any serious consequences for Canada, except for perhaps, when we renegotiate new targets, we're supposed to have even tougher targets, which will have an even harder time to meet. This is the sort of logic of this sort of compromise agreement that was reached in '97. So But I do think it would be, yeah, obviously it's an embarrassing thing.
I think that, internal to the party, I think you have quite a large majority of people in the Conservative Party that have long despised the Kyoto Protocol. The commitment to stay within the Kyoto Protocol is a political one. And I think that the sounds being made now are setting up the party, in a sense, to say, look, we have said, and we've been very honest with Canadians, we cannot make these targets. Election in 2007, potentially there's a move to extract Canada out of Kyoto, but I think the emphasis will be on forcing the international community, in a sense, to say, you got to stay at the table as Canada, and what does that look like? So I could imagine that, in a sense, Canada would be putting the ball back into the court of the international community to ask them, okay, what are the next steps? How do we stay at the table and dialogue, knowing very clearly we're not going to make these targets and we're not going to take a big hit in terms of compliance?
Catherine Sygrover from American University. I wanted to follow up on that question. Given the lack of traction that the clean energy proposals of the past few years in Canada to get credit for the natural gas exports, especially to the United States, given the lack of traction internationally of attempts to put the ball in the court of the rest of the international regime, how would you see that different? And in the question of the CEC, given, again, the lack of institutional success with the CEC, lack of funding, et cetera, why do you think that is something that could potentially become a home for a North American system?
Yeah, I should be clear on the CEC. I don't see it as becoming a home. Definitely not. It's, at the most, a coordinated mechanism that could be put to better use. I'd put it that way. Arguably, if there is a strong effort to come up with a quote-unquote made in Canada, or let's be a little more generous, perhaps made in North America approach, the CEC will inevitably be involved, but we shouldn't exaggerate it. You're quite right. It's often referred to as relatively toothless, and rightly so. That being said, it's done a lot of good work. I don't just say that because it's in Montreal, from Montreal and so on. But I wouldn't exaggerate it. And again, going back to this question of whether, I really think we do need to look seriously, those of us that are concerned about climate change, those of us that are just looking for an excuse to do nothing, have one agenda with Kyoto, to dismiss it. That's fine. That's not my agenda anyway. I don't believe that is the agenda of the vast majority of Canadians. But rather to look past these things and to look more seriously at the regional operations movements that are taking place at the municipal, at the local level. To me, it sounds at this point in time like a political necessity, not just an act of analytic convenience, but rather an act of strategic necessity that this is where the action is going to take place. And I think it's been that way for several years, and that perhaps the honesty that's exhibited by the Conservative government in this regard simply illuminates that. Unless you wanted to.
The only thing I have to add is just on the idea of the clean energy. I'm not involved in the international negotiations or system. I never have been, probably like some of you. But I couldn't imagine that coming back on the table in the first commitment period. I would just see it as a sort of major capitulation on the part of the international community to revisit something that they clearly denied. So I can't see it coming back. And I think all of you here know that there is a lot of natural gas. There should be a lot of natural gas coming down from Canada in the next 10 years. So I can't see it coming back. Yeah.
Here and then over here.
I'm Gary Briner from Brigham University. I'm still puzzled by, and although this has been a very helpful presentation, why there's such animosity among the Conservatives to Kyoto Protocol. Comparing the U.S. to Canada, people often argue that the impacts of climate change are more visible in Canada than the United States, so there ought to be more support for action. That Canada has a stronger tradition of environmental protection, environmental culture, and that lots of industries, fossil fuel industries in the United States, are recognizing that climate regulation's coming. People, even the coal industry, recognize they need to figure out how to produce clean coal. So it seems like that animosity is hard to understand. So it's two questions. Is the opposition to the Kyoto Protocol because conservatives think that it's too expensive to comply, but they're still in favor of doing something, they just think there's a better way? Or do they really think that there's no need to take some kind of regulatory action for climate? And second, depending on how you answer that, what do you think the prospects are for the politics changing? And what would it take for whatever the nature of the conservative opposition is, what would it take for that to change?
You've probably got more to say than I do about this, but just very briefly, I think some of the animosity might be, and I've had people tell me this, this is not an entirely Alberta-based party. That's a misnomer. However, most of the key people involved, including the environment minister and the prime minister and so on, are from that jurisdiction. And there is a sort of internal Canadian issue whereby Quebec and Ontario have dominated Canadian politics for a long, long time. And again, the way that the Kyoto Agreement was sort of, I'll use perhaps a vulgar expression, sort of stuffed down the throats of Albertans, or many people in the West believe that was the case. So this is, I wouldn't be so immature as to suggest that they're payback time, what have you, but I think that there is some animosity that's spilled over at the current stage. And I've actually had people tell me at senior levels of the government tell me that that is the case. That being said, I think that will pass. I think that's a temporary thing. And that, in terms of how we overcome this, well, we have an age-old problem with what's often considered Western isolationism in Canada, in the Canadian federal state. And that's not going to pass easily. And that comes from decades and decades of dominance. Ottawa being dominated by Ontario largely, and Quebec in terms of the prime ministerialship. So that won't pass itself. That's sort of a contextual issue in Canadian politics. However, I think the sort of novelty will wear off of a new Alberta bunch being in Ottawa, and they'll realize that this is, of course, I think they do realize this incidentally, for the most part, that the international community wants something to be done. Again, I'm reluctant to put too much weight on leadership from that side, but and just with regard to in the long term, the sort of self-image of the government, if it does especially achieve a majority and stays in power, I think that could shift, and they'll adopt a more of a what you might call a more traditional Canadian multilateralist perspective. I think could be there as well. But you've got much more insight to this than I do. So.
I think the opposition. There are a number of reasons for it. One, I think there is more of an openness, and I think it may be based and centralized in the Alberta base of the party. That there is somewhat of a party of skepticism in terms of the science approach. Now that I don't know where that is right now, to be honest with you, but say like 4 or 5 years ago, the opposition, being the opposition, was quite interested in criticizing the science. You won't hear that from the government now, so that's at least the history. I mean there are a number of other things too. The slap in the face, the original slap in the face to the provinces. Remember, the strong component of the current Conservative Party is based in Alberta and was really strongly provincialist in its approach. It was very very insistent on protecting the jurisdiction of the provinces in Canada, and so they saw this as another. Again, remember what I said about the negotiation of the protocol in '97. They saw this as a major slap in the face, especially to Alberta. So that's sort of part of the history. Another issue is a couple of other issues that revolve around the international aspect. Is that I think the Conservatives have long seen, as Conservatives, that a more simplified approach, a step-by-step approach to this sort of policy. I mean, before you go off and commit to undertake a huge change, in a sense, in the economy, you have to start with small bits. And I think the big criticism of the Liberals is that they had never done that. And it really was, as Peter said, I mean, it has been years and years of debate and talk and hot air that led to basically no action. So I think their shift, and I think you will see this, is that they will implement probably smaller steps than a lot of people would like, but they will be steps nonetheless that will be quite pragmatic, more localized, definitely very federal. The other thing is they hated the confuting or the bringing together of sort of and I think you touched on this, but sort of the development and environmental, like international development and environment. I mean, the Conservatives want to focus, and they have very much just in their mandate so far, on specific issues. We are going to target this. We're going to get some action accomplished. We're going to do this. Kyoto, for them, I think the hostility is that it was just a far too complicated system, both in terms of administration, but also in terms of monitoring and follow-up. I know from an environmental perspective on a lot of other files, Canada had undertaken Species at Risk Act, similar to your act here in the States, although different in many ways, but had undertaken Species at Risk Act, Kyoto, a number of huge things. And the big criticism, again, is that there is very, very little follow-up for any of these acts. So they're implemented, it's this big political interest, and then there's no follow-up. So I think, again, the Conservatives are interested in accountability principally, and that means environmental accountability as well, and I'm not, this is just their message that I'm speaking of. And they want to see things actually done. So, for instance, with the Species at Risk Act, I think you'll see they're going to see things followed up. They're going to put more into implementation. Again, for the Kyoto Protocol, you're going to see some steps taken to at least start moving in the direction, but much smaller and domestic steps.
Stacy, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up just on this notion of sort of honest conservative government, in the sense that I wonder, is it also possible that the Conservatives will come to the conclusion and say that Canada cannot do anything significant if the United States continues to do nothing at the federal level? I mean, is it really possible from the Conservative standpoint, short of the kinds of things they're likely to be opposed to doing, that Canada can significantly affect its emissions if its economy is deeply integrated into one whose emissions go up continuously forever until something changes?
I think it's a very dangerous message that they will stay away from.
Okay.
I think that the idea of Kyoto and action on climate change is very entrenched with the Canadian public. So I think that the other sensitivity, which everyone in this room is aware of, is that the Conservatives do not want to be seen as too close to the U.S. administration, whatever it may be at the time, but especially the current administration. So I think that messaging will be included in the general messaging that we need to be working with the U.S. because they're our biggest partner, et cetera, but I don't think you'll ever see we won't do anything because the U.S. is offside. I don't think you'll see that.
No, I agree, and I think, well, in many ways the U.S. is ahead of Canada. I mean, that's the honest truth. So we have to face that, and that's something that the people I've spoken with have made it quite clear. Again, as we did in Kyoto, but perhaps hopefully in a more integrated fashion, there will be an effort to do a bit better than the U.S. Through some sort of clean air legislation or a renegotiated CEPA or what have you. So when it comes to the international, not doing anything because the international community is not, or pardon me, because outside actors are not, the only thing that really gets stressed there that I've heard so far are the fact that these non-Annex 1 states, such as China and Brazil and India and so on, are proceeding with expansive economic growth and doing very little to curb emissions in the process. Right? And if there's a sense of futility, that's sort of where I get it. It's, look, in 20 years from now, China will overcome the U.S. in terms of emissions. Whether or not that's true, we don't know. But that's what one of the figures I've heard kicked around. I've heard 20, 30, 40, what have you. But it's going to happen. It's almost viewed as an inevitability now. My response to that is, well, okay, then if you're going to talk about technology transfer, let's get serious about it. And we don't need the CDM and the Kyoto Protocol to do that. that almost becomes an excuse not to do it if Kyoto's not working for us, right? We need to do it more at a more, perhaps even a bilateral level, whatever. But we can help those countries adapt technology that will reduce, let's say, sulfur emissions from coal plants, what have you. So that's where I get the sense that there's a sort of futility. But again, the American is often put forth too, yes. That without their involvement, why should we bother?
Yeah. You had one other question, and that was what can the Liberals do? Or what's that situation? What does that look like? I think the opposition is going to have a hard time in the next couple of years. Long-term Liberals who I work with, who have been in politics a long time, really see a particular trajectory in Canadian politics, which is the rise of the Conservative Party, which of course can change quite quickly, as everything can in politics. But I think that when you look at where the Liberals in particular are going to be, again, by the end of this year and early next year, which is in a fair bit of confusion depending on how their leadership race goes. And again, remember that in terms of climate change, the Liberals really don't have a track record. And the Conservatives continually attack them over that. I mean, you signed on, there was nothing that happening. In fact, our emissions are way up. Look at the states are doing better than us, all those sorts of things. So it's going to be tough, very tough for them to argue their position. And they're going to attack a lot, but again, it comes back to them pretty quickly. So politically, it will be challenging. Yeah.
Joe.
My name is this on? Yeah. My name is Joe Dukert. I'm an energy analyst, and I should preface my comments, which are going to wind up with a real zinger of a question, by saying that I have been a senior advisor to the CEC. And I also prepared the U.S. as a consultant, prepared the U.S. Department of Energy's document submitted to the Congress analyzing the potential economic effects of the Kyoto Protocol ratification. I really like the way Peter started out by saying we have to deal with the realities facing us. If we want to look beyond Kyoto, perhaps we should re-examine the origins of Kyoto, and this gives us some clues as to why it has failed. I've talked with Bob Reinstein, who was a key negotiator in the U.S.-Canadian Free Trade Agreement, and also was present during that late night, early morning session when the Kyoto targets were actually firmed up. And they were pulled out of the air. You're nodding. This is no surprise. So I'm a little puzzled as to why Canadians or people in the States are surprised that we suddenly find out Canada isn't going to meet its targets. The United States couldn't have met its targets if it had ratified and tried. The 1990 date was chosen deliberately to favor the EU and to give Russia something to sell, namely hot air. But shouldn't we be thinking about what the targets of a post-Kyoto operation would be, whether it's a continuation of the treaty or not? And I hope that we will be realistic in examining the potential contribution of the soft renewables and even of hydro, because the number of hydro sites is limited. So I wind up with my question: does any of the panelists have even a vague idea of timing and targets for an international agreement that might follow Kyoto?
Thanks. Okay, yeah. Well, I guess the short answer is no. It's not something that I could give a precise answer for. I think 1990 stabilization, this is the initial thing that we went in with. And that seems to me still to be a reasonable target. But in terms of the timing, I think we might be looking more at, certainly towards the end of the 2008-2012 series, right? So we might look at a 1990 emission stabilization by 2015, something like that. But again, this is something that I'm waiting personally for the Conservatives to come up with this. And the opposition parties yesterday are trying to force this issue. And I would like to see some sort of, I agree, it's time we start talking seriously about it.
My only additional comment would be that pronouncing Kyoto a failure sounds also a bit like we're in Washington to me. In the sense that short of being a glorious success, it clearly is not. But in fact, one of the things that's so striking about how dominant the Kyoto Protocol is in North American climate politics is that no country in North America is within 25 percentage points of getting close to it, and we're still talking about Kyoto, right? And they're built into these states, and Portland is meeting it. I mean, so the extent to which it has influenced people's minds and it really influences politics, I think it's it's a little harsh to pronounce it a failure in sort of some objective sense, that it's actually been quite influential, which is not to say that most of its members are going to make its targets. Right? But I think we have a break, right?
No, I have two questions. Make them quick, and we're going to answer them here and then there. So ask the questions, and then the panel will answer them quickly, and then we'll go to a break.
Thank you. I'm Dick Smith. I was for many years an environmental negotiator with the State Department. I was the U.S. negotiator on the air quality agreement with Canada and the London amendments to the Montreal Protocol. And I wanted to talk a little bit, I guess more briefly than I thought I was going to talk about why Kyoto failed and what we ought to be thinking about in terms of an agreement that might work. It fundamentally reversed the normal process for a successful negotiation, and you went into some of this. We came up with arbitrary, politically determined targets and then tried to sell them to the subnational units, the companies and the states and provinces that need to really take the actions to implement it. Whereas a successful negotiation, like the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, reverses that. We had then a series of workshops with the affected industries. We came up with science-based targets that made sense. We also recognized from the beginning that it was a complicated enough process that we would not initially succeed, so we set up a series of meetings and a process where we would have a scientific committee and an economic committee, which would come back each year, and our initial goals kept getting more ambitious as we found out we were able to do more. We did include a watered-down provision for the developing countries so that they were part of the game, which they weren't in Kyoto. I was back with State as an advisor to State during the time of Kyoto, and one of the things I urged was that for the developing countries, at least, at a minimum, they'd be required to come to a meeting once a year, once every 2 years, where they laid out their program and subjected themselves, sort of like the OECD does on the economies of countries around the world, subjected themselves to pointed criticism and then had to defend their position of making some progress. They might not be able to commit to particular targets, but whether you call it Kyoto or not, there has to be some new approach which is fundamentally different from what we did in Kyoto, which was in that sense a failure because there was just no way in which those politically determined targets could be met.
Thank you, Dick.
I'm Simon Donner. I'm a climate scientist at Princeton University, and I am Canadian, so which was partly my interest in this morning in this afternoon's discussion. I was curious about, maybe this is trying a bit of revisionist history, but if oil prices didn't go up and you sort of take out the development of the tar sands, would it actually have been that hard for Canada to meet Kyoto? I mean, not maybe get to the 6% below by 2008, but wouldn't have been as far off because I think it's at the point now where Alberta is probably, because of the tar sands, is responsible for a quarter or more of the greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, and it's maybe 10% of the population, I think less than that. And you see that Quebec was interested in doing things through hydropower, Manitoba was interested. Ontario, while probably not getting that much done, is planning to shut down the coal generating power plants, which probably on its own would meet Ontario's Kyoto commitment. So it just makes me wonder, because of that, is there do you see then an opportunity for provincial-based targets or maybe a provincial trading system within the federal system, realizing that a lot of the provinces maybe could have done this?
Yeah, there is a potential there. There are some issues. Quebec, for example, because of its hydropower, in terms of negotiating the price of credits and so forth, Quebec has a unique position. And I could fail badly nationally, but definitely there's potential. I don't know about the tar sand decision, and obviously that's related to American demand for energy. So yes, to that extent, as long as the quote-unquote addiction to oil remains one of the defining characteristics of the American economy, then we will have a harder time meeting any sort of commitments that we make. That's a conscious decision to rely on that export market. On the other hand, I don't know. I'm not sure actually in terms of the science whether or not if the tar sands had not been opened up, if we would have made. I don't think we would have made our commitments regardless, but certainly would have come closer.
It is obviously the oil sands are huge. Again, I said this, but greenhouse gas source, and I guess the sensitivity again from a political perspective is that the oil sands in particular have very much driven Canada's economy over the last few years. Have been a principal driver of Canada's economy. So without that, if the economy was just humming along pre-oil sands, who knows how it would have done, but certainly wouldn't have done as well, and maybe we wouldn't even be talking about something like a taxation of the large final emitters. So I guess that's something to consider. Yeah.
I would just follow up. I think it's great, by the way, that we started the session by talking about how we had to get beyond Kyoto, and we've ended up talking about Kyoto. But I will just say again, I think I'm not sure that that blaming arbitrary decisions in Kyoto or a failure of the Kyoto Protocol is the same as saying that the Liberal government in Canada and the Democratic one in the United States made promises that they had no intention or plan to keep. And so if it's you got, I think it's dangerous to say that that's what's wrong with the process that produced it, rather than whether that's pointing the blame at the wrong place.
All right, with that, I'm going to cut this short right now and say we're going to go for a break, and we'll be back at 2:45. We will start whether you're here or not.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much.
You